He sat alone in the cold, dimly lit cell, staring at the concrete walls like they were closing in on him. His name was David, a man who had never hurt anyone, yet here he was, locked away for a crime he didn't commit. Someone had framed him, planted drugs in his car, and called the cops. But why and who could be so cruel? The truth was even more shocking. His neighbors, driven by jealousy because of his success online, had orchestrated the perfect trap. They thought they could ruin him and get away with it. They didn't count on David's mind, sharp and resourceful, even behind bars. He had no family, no one to turn to, except one friend. Mathew, the only person he trusted. Mathew was the key to uncovering the truth, the only one who could access the hidden security footage that proved David's innocence. But there was a problem. The footage was locked behind a password only Mathew knew, stored on David's laptop that no one had seen. Time was running out, and every second in that cell felt like it was closing in faster than the last. That's when Carla, the Texas police officer assigned to his block, stepped into the picture. She was strict, tough, but fair. Most prisoners feared her, yet David saw something different, an unexpected chance, a sliver of hope. With a trembling voice, he made a request that no officer had ever heard before. He asked her to call Mathew, to tell him to hire a lawyer and retrieve the proof hidden in the footage. It sounded simple, but the stakes couldn't have been higher. What Carla didn't know yet was that by helping David, she was stepping into a web of lies, jealousy, and danger she could never have anticipated. One wrong move and David's chance at freedom, and possibly her own safety, would vanish forever. As she stared at him, the weight of his words hanging in the air, Carla faced a choice: follow the rules, or take a risk that could change everything. Would she help him? Could she? And most importantly, could David's innocence survive long enough to be revealed? The answer was hidden in plain sight, locked away where only the brave could reach it. And in the next few minutes, you're going to see exactly what happened, how a single call, one act of courage, and a desperate plan became the difference between freedom and injustice. David's mornings always began the same way. The soft hum of his laptop filled the small apartment, sunlight streaming through the blinds, highlighting the neat rows of books and gadgets he had collected over the years. At 32, he had carved out a life entirely on his own, successful, independent, and disciplined. His work online gave him freedom and comfort that many only dreamed of. Yet, despite his accomplishments, he remained quietly unassuming, avoiding unnecessary attention in his neighborhood. His friend Mathew often teased him about it. "One day you'll have to leave this quiet little street behind and show the world what you've built," he'd say, sipping coffee at David's kitchen table. David would just smile, shrugging off the idea. For him, stability was more important than recognition. David's neighbors, however, saw things differently. Roger, a man who had lived across the street for over a decade, couldn't hide his jealousy. He watched David's every success with simmering resentment. While David spent his evenings refining his projects or helping clients online, Roger spent his time complaining about his own misfortunes, blaming anyone who seemed to live better than him. There was an unspoken tension lingering in the air, but David chose to ignore it. Even in his isolation, David maintained a connection to humanity through small gestures. A smile to the mailman, a wave to the few neighbors he knew well, a patient reply to anyone seeking advice online. But the world he had built around himself, his sanctuary of order and routine, was about to be tested. It started with subtle glances, the kind that lingered too long in the grocery store, the whispered jokes that weren't meant for him, but made him uncomfortable anyway. David noticed, but he refused to see them as more than human pettiness. Deep down, he knew things could escalate, but he never imagined the scale of what was coming. In truth, David's life was an example of quiet success against odds he'd never discuss. A black man living in a predominantly white neighborhood, achieving financial independence through online work, he had already faced prejudice in small ways over the years. But he thought he was prepared. He didn't realize how far envy and discrimination could stretch when combined with greed and malice. As the sun set one evening, David closed his laptop, unaware that this would be the last night of peace he would ever know. Outside, Roger and a few others had begun plotting. A plan that would turn David's life upside down and thrust him into a nightmare of false accusations. Law enforcement scrutiny and racial prejudice he had only ever seen from a distance. This was the calm before the storm, the serene life that made the coming injustice feel all the more cruel. In the next chapter, David would learn that even in a world that feels orderly and fair, hatred and jealousy can strike without warning, shattering everything in an instant. David's life, once orderly and predictable, spiraled into chaos almost overnight. The morning he discovered the planted drugs in his car, a cold wave of disbelief and anger washed over him. He had parked in his usual spot, the street quiet as ever, yet somehow his world had been infiltrated by lies and envy. The officers who arrived were polite but unquestioning, treating him as though guilt were already written across his face. "Sir, do you know why we're here?" one officer asked, handing him the handcuffs. David opened his mouth to protest, to explain, but his words were drowned in the mechanical certainty of procedure. He was arrested. The sense of injustice settled over him like a heavy fog, suffocating yet sharp, a bitter taste of helplessness. Inside the station, the tension escalated. Other inmates whispered, some curious, some hostile, sensing the new prisoner's outsider status. David felt eyes on him, judging, sizing him up, not just for being a newcomer but for the color of his skin. He realized, painfully, that the neighborhood's envy wasn't just a personal attack. It had triggered a system that could so easily crush him. Carla, the officer assigned to his block, noticed his restraint. Unlike many prisoners who lapsed into anger or fear, David held himself with an almost quiet dignity, a composure that made her curious. Something in her gut told her he wasn't like the others. Yet the rules of the system left her little room to intervene, and the bureaucracy surrounding him was relentless. Word spread quickly. Within days, neighbors whispered, rumors inflamed, and a social media post by someone claiming David's crime went viral. He became a target of public humiliation, his name twisted, and his reputation shredded before any truth could surface. Each new insult, each accusatory glance hammered away at the life he had built. But David wasn't entirely alone. Mathew, sensing that something was terribly wrong, began his quiet investigation from afar. He watched the security footage stored on David's laptop, noting hidden cameras that captured the truth. But without the password, the proof remained just out of reach. The tension was unbearable. Every hour that passed without intervention felt like a countdown toward permanent ruin. Inside the cell, David's days were long and punishing. Routine checks, endless questions, and whispered threats from other inmates built an environment where frustration and helplessness could grow like wildfire. Yet he refused to surrender to despair. Instead, he found subtle ways to reclaim control, memorizing every corner of the cell, noting every guard rotation, even observing Carla, gauging her reactions, silently hoping she might help. And then came the day that would push everything to the edge. Roger, the neighbor, seemingly satisfied with the chaos he had sown, made a move that could seal David's fate. He contacted law enforcement anonymously, adding false evidence that painted David as a repeat offender. The tension inside the station skyrocketed. Officers questioned him more aggressively. The media picked up fragments of the story, and the walls closed in even tighter. In this storm of deception and prejudice, David's only lifeline was Carla, the officer who could bridge the gap between the truth and the injustice closing in around him. But would she act? Could she risk her career or even her safety to help a man the system was ready to devour? As David sat on his concrete bed that night, staring at the cold ceiling, he formulated a plan. He would ask Carla for one thing, a single act that could give Mathew access to the evidence and finally reveal the truth. It was dangerous, audacious, and uncertain, but it was the only way. The cell door creaked. Carla's shadow fell across the floor. Everything hinged on what happened in the next few moments. One word, one decision, could alter the course of David's life forever or ensure his downfall. The prison was unusually silent that morning, the kind of stillness that makes every footstep echo like a warning. David had barely slept, his mind racing with plans, fears, and fragments of hope. Today was the day. If Carla acted, if Mathew got the footage in time, the truth could finally see the light. If not, It could be the point of no return. Carla approached the cell, her face tight with the conflict she had wrestled with for days. She knew the rules, knew the consequences if she crossed the line. Yet, she also knew David wasn't like the others, that he was innocent, and that inaction would be complicity. Her hand trembled slightly as she unlocked the small hatch in the door. David's eyes met hers, a mixture of desperation, trust, and silent pleading. "Carla, I need you to call him. Mathew, tell him everything." "He knows the password," he said, his voice low but urgent. "It's the only way." Carla hesitated. The corridor was empty, but the risk was real. One wrong call, one misstep, and both their lives could be ruined. Her mind raced. She thought of her career, her reputation, and her safety. But then she looked at David, his hands clenched around the cold bars, eyes filled with a raw vulnerability she couldn't ignore. With a steadying breath, she picked up the phone. "Tell him, now." Her voice was firm but quiet, cutting through the tension like a lifeline thrown across a stormy sea. Meanwhile, across town, Mathew received the call. Panic surged through him, but there was no time for hesitation. He grabbed the laptop, entered the password he had memorized from countless shared conversations with David, and accessed the hidden CCTV footage. What he saw made his blood run cold. Roger and two accomplices planting drugs in David's car under the cover of night. Their faces caught clearly on camera, undeniable proof of David's innocence. Back at the prison, tension built like a storm ready to break. Word of the evidence spread quickly through the proper channels thanks to Mathew's quick actions. Lawyers arrived, confrontations erupted, and the atmosphere became electric with anticipation. David's cellmate, once hostile, now looked at him with a mix of awe and relief, realizing this wasn't just another case, it was a battle for truth itself. But Roger wasn't done. He had already spread lies, manipulated witnesses, and worked hard to ensure David's downfall. Even as lawyers pushed forward, threats loomed from unexpected corners, including some corrupt officers who were slow to believe David's side of the story. Every second felt like an eternity as David waited, heart hammering, for justice to arrive. Then came the courtroom showdown. The CCTV footage played on a large screen. Roger's smug expressions dissolved into panic as undeniable evidence filled the room. Murmurs spread through the spectators. The judge's gaze shifted, and the balance of power swung violently in David's favor. David felt a strange surge of emotion, a mix of relief, anger, and vindication. He had been powerless in a world designed to crush him, but now, armed with truth and courage, he could finally reclaim it. His fists clenched in silent triumph as the courtroom absorbed the shock, and just when it seemed the storm had passed, a final, unexpected twist arrived. A whistleblower, one of the officers who had initially ignored David's pleas, stepped forward with additional evidence implicating more conspirators. The room erupted, the tide turning completely. David's freedom was imminent. But the consequences for those who tried to destroy him were about to hit even harder. As Carla watched from the back, she felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. Knowing the system had almost failed him, and that without courage and trust, justice might never have prevailed. David stood, shoulders straight, looking at the judge, the officers, and the shocked faces around him. His voice, calm but firm, carried across the courtroom. "I didn't ask for this fight, but I refused to be silent. The truth always finds a way. And now, it's time to be heard." The gavel pounded. Silence fell, and in that silence, one question lingered. What would happen to the people who had tried to destroy him, and how far would they go to cover their tracks? The courtroom had emptied, leaving behind only echoes of the drama that had unfolded. David stepped out into the sunlight, the warm rays almost blinding after the dim shadows of the prison and the oppressive courtroom. For the first time in weeks, he felt free, not just in body, but in spirit. The weight that had pressed on him for months, the anxiety, the fear, the creeping sense of helplessness, it was lifting, slowly but unmistakably. Justice had been served. The CCTV footage had proven his innocence beyond any doubt. Roger and his accomplices faced criminal charges, and the corrupt officers who had initially dismissed David's claims were under investigation. The courtroom's judgment had reverberated far beyond those walls, sending a clear message: prejudice, malice, and falsehood could no longer stand unchallenged when courage and truth prevailed. But the consequences of what David had endured went deeper than the legal victory. He had been forced to confront the ugly reality of systemic racism, the subtle and overt ways society punishes success for some while tolerating envy and discrimination for others. Even though he was free, the scars, emotional, mental, and social, remained. Yet he refused to let them define him. He knew that survival and growth required more than vindication. It demanded purpose. Mathew remained at his side, unwavering and steadfast. Together, they worked to ensure the evidence of the injustice was shared widely, not to humiliate those who had tried to ruin David, but to prevent similar attacks from happening to anyone else. The story became a symbol of resilience, a testament to what can happen when loyalty, determination, and courage intersect. Carla, too, felt the impact profoundly. By taking a risk and acting on her moral compass, she had not only helped save an innocent man, but also challenged the rigidity of the system she served. She had learned that rules without empathy can perpetuate injustice, and that true courage sometimes means stepping into uncertainty to protect what is right. David's neighborhood, once a microcosm of envy and prejudice, slowly shifted. While some remained bitter, the exposure of the truth forced a reckoning. Families whispered apologies, community leaders spoke openly about bias, and slowly, bridges began to form. It wasn't perfect. Prejudice doesn't vanish overnight. But the ripples of justice and truth created space for dialogue, awareness, and understanding. David rebuilt his life deliberately, carefully. He invested in community programs that supported young people from marginalized backgrounds, sharing both the lessons he had learned and the tools that had helped him survive. He spoke publicly about the dangers of unchecked prejudice, the importance of digital evidence and transparency, and the strength that comes from trusting those who truly care. Yet, even as his life regained a sense of normalcy, David never forgot the fear and isolation of those prison days. They became a quiet but persistent motivator, a reminder that freedom is fragile and that vigilance, courage, and community are essential to protect it. The moral of David's story resonated far beyond his personal circle. Racism, envy, and falsehoods destroy not just individual lives but communities as a whole. The ripple effects of prejudice weaken the very bonds that hold society together. Conversely, courage, unity, and the pursuit of truth can heal wounds, strengthen ties, and restore justice where it has been denied. By the time David returned to his apartment, it felt different, like the space had shifted along with his own sense of self. The morning sunlight now seemed brighter, more welcoming, the hum of his laptop a comforting reminder of control and agency. He reached out to Mathew, thanking him not just for loyalty, but for believing in him when the world seemed determined not to. Carla, standing at the edge of the neighborhood, watched David from a distance. She felt a sense of fulfillment rare in her line of work. Though the system had faltered, individual courage had ensured justice prevailed. She knew that small acts of bravery, even in the face of overwhelming odds, could ripple outward, changing lives in ways that rules and policies never could. In the weeks that followed, David's story spread. People were moved by the tale of resilience and the triumph of truth over lies. Yet the story wasn't just about victory, it was about the journey through fear, betrayal, and systemic obstacles. It was a reminder that the fight against prejudice requires both courage and persistence, and that allies can appear in unexpected forms when one refuses to be silent. Ultimately, David's life became a testament to endurance, a symbol of the power of integrity and trust. He proved that one person's voice, when combined with loyalty, courage, and action, can pierce through the darkest injustices. And in the quiet moments, when the world seemed still and safe again, he would remember the lesson that had carried him through every trial, that courage defeats hate, unity brings healing, and the truth, no matter how long suppressed, always finds its way to the light. As the sun set over the neighborhood, David looked out his window, breathing in the calm he had earned. He knew that life would always carry challenges, that injustice would never vanish entirely, but he had learned something far more powerful, that even in the darkest moments, courage, trust, and determination can illuminate the path to freedom.